It is noontime in the bustling streets of London. Suddenly, without warning, a slender, silent, black and white rocket comes streaking down out of the sky. A huge explosion shatters buildings, flings debris, and bores a massive crater 20 meters wide and 8 meters deep. In 1945, Wernher von Braun, the Nazi scientist who created this formidable weapon, has surrendered to the American army. The US government is faced with a choice. Do they try and convict him as a war criminal, or do they take him to the United States to work on their own rocket program? 24 years later, a majestic 362-foot rocket is preparing for launch. It will take a crew of 3 men where no man has ever gone before, the very surface of the moon. Because of the US government's decision to bring von Braun into the country as an engineer instead of as a prisoner, they achieved one of the greatest milestones in human history. Wernher von Braun's early career with the Nazis is questionable, but was he really a war criminal? What was to be done in the face of the Soviet missile and weapons advancements? The United States had a right and a responsibility to use von Braun's expertise for the defense of the American people.
As a young adult, Wernher von Braun, a German of noble birth, joined a pioneering amateur rocket society, the Society of Space Travel. In 1932, several German army officers came to one of the group's rocket launches. There, Major Walter Dornberger met the charismatic young von Braun and was so impressed that he invited him to study physics and engineering at the prestigious University of Berlin at the Army's expense.
While Wernher was still completing his studies, Adolf Hitler became the Supreme Chancellor of Germany. After graduating in 1934 with a PhD in physics, Wernher was immediately hired by the German army to work on his lifelong dream, rockets. 5 years later, he was required to join the Nazi Party. While Hitler was invading Poland and triggering the Second World War in 1939, von Braun was hard at work at his dedicated rocket research facility at Peenemünde. There, he and a large staff were designing and testing the most infamous rocket of all time, the awesome V2. Because of the intense pressure by high Nazi officials to deploy the V2 as a weapon, limited production began before the rocket's design was completely finalized. The V2 was manufactured at an underground production facility near the Dora concentration camp, where prisoners were barely fed and literally worked to death. The facility became known as the Middlework, or production plant.
Von Braun definitely knew about the inhumane conditions at Middlework, and he visited the factory several times.
Many feel that because of his position of power in the V2 program and his knowledge of the slave labor being used, von Braun was responsible for war crimes and therefore a war criminal.
He knew about it, he visited it multiple times. He was directly involved personally with the choice of prisoners at Buchenwald to bring them to Dora to work. All of these would have made him a war criminal.
But the system of concentration camp labor was strictly defined by the SS, and the totalitarian Nazi government did not allow its citizens to do whatever they pleased. According to Dr. Michael Neufeld, a modern expert on von Braun, his ability to stop the use of slave labor was zero.
In early 1944, von Braun and a fellow engineer expressed sorrow that the V2 was being used as a weapon and regretted they were not simply designing a rocket for space travel. They also asserted that the war was not going well. These illegal comments were reported by a young SS spy, and von Braun was arrested by the Gestapo. His mentor and boss, Walter Dornberger, had to make an appeal to Heinrich Müller, the chief of the Gestapo, to order his release. From this point on, von Braun's situation was very precarious.
In January of 1945, von Braun called together a group of the V2 project heads to discuss plans to surrender. Germany was obviously losing the war, and they all knew that the Americans and the Soviets would both want their knowledge of rocket technology. In a unanimous decision, the group resolved to surrender to the Americans.
He was interested in having someone pay for his work. And let's face it, the end of the war presented a very stark situation. Nazi Germany had catastrophically collapsed. The country was wrecked. The question was whether anybody else would be interested in funding this work. And clearly he understood that ultimately what he was most valuable for in the short run was military technology, ballistic missiles. But he also was hoping, as I mentioned earlier, that he would like to go into space, and he would like to go to the moon, and that the United States was the one country that might actually be able to afford it. I mean, on the one hand, he wanted to continue rocket technology for his own personal reasons, but he also wanted to continue with the United States because he was anti-communist and was afraid of the Soviet Union, and he wanted to give the technology to the United States or the Western powers first and not to the Soviet Union.
In May of 1945, von Braun and his team were safely delivered into American hands. With von Braun and his team in their custody, the United States began the process of bringing them across the Atlantic. This program was codenamed Operation Paperclip. U.S. intelligence teams began comprehensive background checks into the engineers' Nazi involvement and selected those who were suitable. In reference to von Braun, an FBI document asserts that
this file reflects that a security evaluation by the Director of Intelligence, Department of the Army, did not consider applicant a war criminal, nor did evidence exist that he was an ardent Nazi.
According to the United States War Department, the purpose of Operation Paperclip was to take full advantage of those significant developments which are deemed vital to our national security. Captain B. N. Webb of the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency assured the Director of Intelligence in an April 1946 memorandum,
in light of the situation existing in Europe today, it is conceivable that continued delay and opposition to the immigration of these scientists could result in their eventually falling into the hands of the Russians, who would then gain the valuable information and ability possessed by these men. Such an eventuality could have a most serious and adverse effect on the national security of the United States.
In light of the looming Soviet military threat, Captain Webb also stated that to continue to treat Nazi affiliations as significant considerations has been aptly phrased as beating a dead Nazi horse. The US felt that they had a responsibility to use von Braun's expertise in order to protect the people of the United States.
Von Braun and the other German scientists were transferred to the United States and were made citizens in late 1954. They worked for the Army in relative obscurity for over 10 years, first at Fort Bliss, Texas, and later Huntsville, Alabama. Von Braun became the first director of the Marshall Space Flight Center at Huntsville in 1960 and was the chief architect of the most powerful machine ever created by man, the awe-inspiring Saturn V.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong set foot on the desolate lunar surface. It may have been one small step for Neil, but it was the fulfillment of a lifelong dream for Wernher von Braun. This monumental event could not have happened without the unique talent and vision of von Braun and his team. But not only did von Braun play an extremely important role in the American space program, but he also helped to defend the United States. The rocket technology he developed for space travel directly translated into better military technology for defense against a possible Soviet attack.
Wernher von Braun was a dreamer of space who was tragically caught up into crimes against humanity. Regardless of his affiliation with the Nazi Party, the United States government had a responsibility to use Wernher von Braun's expertise in defense against the Soviet military threat. By fulfilling this responsibility, the US both protected its citizens and became the first nation to truly journey into the frontier of space.